And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is MLS time here. I'm going to sort of just go through both conferences and talk about some of the biggest things I'm looking for as we get into these final 2 or 3 games of the regular season. Starting in the East, put this nice graphic together. Games played, points, and the remaining schedule for all of the teams that I feel like have a real shot to still get into the postseason. This is not a mathematically sound table, if you will. It doesn't mean that every other team is mathematically eliminated. These are just the teams I feel like are worth still discussing within the playoff context still. In the East, the 3 things I'm looking at, of course, can the Union win the Supporters' Shield and their battle with LAFC? That battle for home field advantage in the first round, particularly those 3 and 4 spots, because Montreal is going to get 2. But you've got a lot of maneuvering that can happen kind of in the middle of the table. And then, of course, who gets in and who is left on the outside looking in. The team that is really, really interesting for me in this is Orlando. Right? You look at that schedule. At NYCFC, at Miami, home against Columbus. Depending on how these games go, Orlando could gift somebody a playoff spot by beating Inter Miami and Columbus, or could play themselves out of the playoffs by losing to Inter Miami and Columbus. If they draw NYCFC and lose those 2 other games, you're putting yourself in a really, really bad position if you're Orlando City. And so we have these matchups of these teams on, right? That's 6, 7, and 8 in the Eastern Conference. They're all going to... Orlando at 6 is going to play 7 and 8. So sort of that head-to-head dynamic is at play here. So that's a team I'm really, really looking at that's going to be decisive and kind of the main character, if you will, in this Eastern Conference playoff story as we get into these last 2 weeks of the season. And then the other thing, the 2 Ohio teams. Of course, sort of going back and forth with each other, but the Crew, 1 win, 1 loss since August 6th. That's 8 games. The rest of them, draws. And I saw Columbus Dispatch did a story that Caleb Porter had. I think it was the Dispatch reporter. There was an hour-long meeting with the team trying to figure out how to not keep dropping points at the end of games. Because if they miss the playoffs, that is why. Their inability to close games is baffling, and it's continuing down the stretch here. This is still an issue that has not been addressed. And of course, they are still in fine position here. You've got 3 games left. If you get, 7 points from them, you're probably in the playoffs. It's not like they need 400 things to go right to get in. But I'm just sitting here scratching my head as to how Columbus now finds themselves behind Inter Miami and out of the playoffs this deep into the season. And then Cincinnati. Wanted to point this out. The last time Cincinnati lost was July 17th. 4 wins and 7 draws since then. So, it's not like they're winning every single game. But July 17th, last loss for FC Cincinnati. And so here they go as these teams kind of go up and down and are not consistently picking up points. They're just charging right up the table. Spent most of the season in that 6, 7, 8 range and are now all the way up to 5th. Of course, they've got that extra game, so could very easily drop back down once you get these games in hand made up in the middle of next week. And also you look at that schedule. Chicago, DC. That should be 6 points. And so Cincinnati could very easily end up potentially hosting a playoff game. Certainly has a really good opportunity to finish and make sure that they're not sort of in high stress, we might miss the playoffs mode on decision day. They're in a really, really good position. Pat Noonan's done a tremendous job. There is no reason this team should miss the playoffs at this point. Cincinnati should be in for the very first time. If not, they've only got themselves to blame because they've done the hard work. They put themselves in an excellent position. And then 2 more things real quick. Inter Miami. On a 2-game winning streak. Can that turn into 3 more really good games to make sure they get into the playoffs? I've talked about this throughout the season with this team. They are consistently inconsistent. It's a winning streak. It's 2, 3, 4 wins in a row. Then it's 3 losses. It's 2 wins and a draw. Then 2 losses and a draw. It's just up and down, patches of good results, patches of bad results, and it just kind of bounces back and forth between the two. So the track record suggests this is not going to be a great end to the season. And Toronto's kind of a wild card here because they're not going to make the playoffs, but you certainly don't want to play those players, regardless of what's at stake. You're just trying to get as many minutes with them all on the field together at this point, I would assume, if you're Bob Bradley. So that's an interesting game. And then you got Orlando, and you might catch a break with Montreal in that final game with kind of nothing left to play for, potentially. So the stage is set. Inter Miami's going to have to prove whether they've got what it takes here. They have the spot now, tied on points with Columbus, though. And it's going to have to be a little bit more of an extended run if they want to make sure they get this done, probably. Now, maybe they catch a break and the teams behind them, particularly Columbus, drops enough points where you don't actually have to do that much to get yourself in if you're into Miami. But I'm looking at that and kind of, can they buck this trend of going from bad to good to bad and sort of have a good final month or 5 weeks of the season to get themselves into the playoffs? And then Charlotte. I threw them in here, right? They've got that extra game. So maximum point possibility. You add 9 points and that could be enough to get in. Now, context is important here because of that schedule. The Union are trying to win a Supporters' Shield, the Crew are trying to make the playoffs, and the Red Bulls are trying to make sure they host a home playoff game. So Charlotte is going to earn this if Charlotte is going to find a way to leapfrog, 3 teams here and get in. It's been a fairly good first season, plenty to build on after a rough start. The schedule scares me. I don't think they're going to have enough. But stranger things have happened. So I did keep them in there because they've got that extra game. And so, they could, even 7 points gets you to 45. And so then you're talking about Inter Miami and Columbus needing 3 points to match you. And there's a world in which that doesn't happen. Of course, it's unlikely, but I didn't want to rule Charlotte out just yet. And then moving to the West. Main storylines, pretty similar. Of course, LAFC and the Supporters' Shield. And I narrowed this down specifically to the battle for 4th place. Because in theory, it could get a little bit more interesting than that. But I look at that schedule for FC Dallas and the way FC Dallas are playing right now, and I don't see them dropping from 3rd. They're in a terrific position, and those are 2 games they should win. At least get 4 points from. So really it's about this battle for 4th, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4 teams within 2 points of each other. 4, 5, 6, and 7, those final 4 playoff teams. This could go any number of different directions because they're so close to each other. And then, of course, the final playoff spots. Nashville in particular. So 4 straight wins. Followed that up with 2 draws. They really kicked things on these last couple months. Those draws were against the Galaxy and Austin, so no shame there. And that LAFC game could be one of the headliners of Decision Day because of what it can mean for both teams. LAFC, that could determine a supporters shield, or at least play a big role in that depending on what the Union do. And for Nashville, I mean, if they lose at Houston, potentially they could need at least a point or 3 to get into the playoffs. It could also be an opportunity to clinch a home playoff game. There is plenty at stake for both teams, so I'm looking at that as one of the best games, most intriguing, most important games on Decision Day. And the team I am looking at as kind of the main character in the West that's going to play a huge role in determining how this all shakes out, the Portland Timbers. You look at what they have left, right? So they're the other team that LAFC plays. Got them at home. And then they're going to RSL. If you lose to LAFC, all of a sudden that RSL game becomes really, really interesting, potentially. And almost certainly, because you're still a maximum of 3 points ahead of them if you lose in your Portland. So we're talking about ramifications for the Supporters Shield. If Portland win both of these games, you could very easily see them be a factor for that 4th spot and potentially get it because they're right there in that conversation. If they're sort of average between the two, it could, help Nashville's case, for example, to get that final home play, be the last team to get the home playoff game. And depending on what Portland does against RSL, that could also determine whether Real Salt Lake gets into the postseason, which would then, of course, determine somebody else's fate as well, potentially. So there's a lot going on. The Timbers are the team I'm looking at in the West, similar to Orlando in the East, that those are the matchups, kind of just the way the schedule broke out and the way the standings are. The results of the Timbers games are going to have massive ramifications kind of up and down the Western Conference. The Galaxy, winnable games left, home against RSL, at Houston. Hasn't been perfect, but they are doing enough, and they always kind of had those games in hand. Coming out of that Seattle Sounders game, I really thought this team was going to do enough to get in. They definitely tested that belief at times, but find themselves in a good position here. And then want to highlight the two teams really struggling at the moment. That is Minnesota United and Real Salt Lake. Minnesota, 2 goals in their last 5 games, 4 losses and a draw. RSL, 1 goal in their last 4, 3 losses and a draw. And so now you find those teams behind the LA Galaxy and the Portland Timbers and fighting for that final playoff spot. The good news for Minnesota, you look at that schedule, there are plenty of points to be had there. RSL, not so much. But the flip side to that is, because you are playing teams that you are directly battling for this final playoff spot, you still control your own destiny to a exceptional degree. If you win those games, that means you're also taking, right, they're both 6-pointers. You're taking 3 points away from a team that is fighting for those final playoff spots with you, that is limiting the maximum amount of points they can get. So that's a big part of this too, that you have to score the goals and you have to win the games. But if I'm RSL, I would almost rather have it that way, where I know if I do my job, I'm in a really, really good position. I don't have to rely on other people to do all of these things to get me into the postseason. Ultimately, I don't see this top 7 in terms of the actual teams changing. I think Minnesota does enough. RSL, it just kind of felt like this drop was coming. They had done so well to stay in sort of that top 4 of the West for so long. And now the goals aren't coming. So I would be surprised, not shocked, but surprised if we see the playoff spots change hands. What I do expect is just a jumbled mess in the order of these 7 teams changing 500,000 times between now and the final whistles on decision day. There are just too many matchups, sort of 6-pointers with ramifications for both teams that are going to move teams up and down the table, change what teams need to do to clinch playoff spots or home field in the first round of the playoffs, whatever it might be. So we are set for a phenomenal end to the season, both in the East and the West. So much to play for, from the Supporters Shield, home field in that first round, and of course, those final playoff spots. You won't want to miss it starting this weekend now that we're back from the international break.